The dust from the stagecoach had barely settled when Katherine Pierce saw him standing outside the Mercantile, and 12 years of carefully constructed composure shattered like glass beneath a hammer. Xavier Montgomery looked older, harder, with lines etched around his eyes that spoke of sorrow and sun-scorched days. But those were still the same hands that had held her face the night before he left Great Bend without a word, without a promise, without anything but the echo of her foolish heart breaking in the Kansas darkness. It was May of 1878, and Katherine had built a life from the ruins he had left behind. She owned the boarding house on 3rd Street now, the one her aunt had passed down to her 5 years prior. She had boarders who depended on her, a garden that flourished under her careful tending, and a reputation in Great Bend as a woman of substance and dignity. She had survived his abandonment, the whispers of pity from neighbors, the long nights when she was 19 and certain she would die from the pain of loving someone who had simply vanished like morning mist over the Arkansas River. Xavier's eyes found hers across the wide dirt street, and she watched something crumble in his expression. Regret. She recognized it immediately because she had seen it in her own mirror often enough in those first terrible years. But she had no regret left now, only the hard-won peace of a woman who had learned to live with ghosts. She turned away, lifting her skirts to avoid the mud near the water trough, and walked with deliberate steadiness toward her boarding house. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained serene. She had become an expert at hiding what she felt. Katherine. His voice reached her before she made it 10 steps, that same deep timbre that had once whispered promises against her skin. Katherine, please. She stopped, but did not turn around. The main street of Great Bend bustled around them with the usual afternoon commerce. Wagons creaked past loaded with grain from the surrounding farms. Women with shopping baskets paused to gossip outside the general store. Children chased a hoop down the wooden sidewalk. Life continued as it always did, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath the vast Kansas sky. "I have nothing to say to you," Katherine said quietly, still not turning. "Then just listen." He had come closer. She could feel the heat of him behind her, could smell the trail dust and leather and something else, something that brought back memories of stolen kisses behind the church and dancing at the harvest social when she was 17 and stupid enough to believe in forever. Why should I? Now she did turn, and she made sure her face showed nothing but cool politeness, the expression she used with difficult boarders or aggressive salesmen. "You made your choice 12 years ago, Xavier. You do not get to walk back into my life and demand my attention." His face was weathered now, tanned dark from years under an unforgiving sun. There was a scar along his jawline that had not been there before, and his shoulders seemed broader, though perhaps that was just the weight of whatever he carried. He looked at her with such naked pain that something in her chest tightened despite her determination to feel nothing. "I made the worst mistake of my life," he said, his voice rough, "and I have spent every single day since then knowing it. How unfortunate for you." Katherine adjusted her shawl, a nervous gesture she immediately regretted because it showed weakness. "If you will excuse me, I have a business to run. Katie, please." The old nickname, the one only he had used, hit her like a physical blow. 5 minutes, that is all I ask. You ask too much." But even as she said it, she knew she would give him those 5 minutes, because despite everything, despite the years and the pain and the careful rebuilding of her life, some part of her still needed to understand why. Why he had left. Why he had not written. Why he had taken her heart, and then simply disappeared into the west as though she had meant nothing at all. She walked to the small park near the river where a few cottonwood trees provided shade from the afternoon heat. Xavier followed at a respectful distance. When they were away from the curious eyes of the town, she sat on one of the wooden benches and folded her hands in her lap, waiting. He stood before her, hat in his hands, turning it over and over in a gesture that might have moved her once. "My father came to me the night before I left," he began. "He told me that our ranch was drowning in debt, that he had made bad investments, gambled money we did not have. He said if I did not leave immediately and go work for his brother in Colorado, we would lose everything. My mother, my sisters, they would have nowhere to go." Katherine listened without expression, though something cold settled in her stomach. "He made me promise not to tell anyone, not even you. He said if word got out about our financial troubles, the bank would foreclose immediately. He said I had to go that very night, that there was no time for goodbyes." Xavier's hands tightened on his hat brim. "I believed him, Katie. I was 22 years old and stupid, and I believed every word. And in 12 years, you could not have written me a single letter." Her voice remained steady, though the words cost her. "You could not have sent word that you were alive, that you had not simply decided I was not worth the trouble of a proper farewell. I did right." His eyes met hers, desperate for her to believe him. "I wrote every week for the first 2 years. Long letters telling you everything, begging you to understand, asking you to wait for me. I sent them to your father's house, to the address I knew." Katherine felt something shift inside her, a tremor in the foundation of the anger she had built so carefully. "I received no letters." "I know that now." Xavier sat down on the bench beside her, though he kept a careful distance between them. "When I finally had enough money saved to come back, I went to your father's house first. He told me you had married, that you had moved to Dodge City with your husband, that you wanted nothing to do with me and I should leave you in peace." The world seemed to tilt slightly. Katherine gripped the edge of the bench, her knuckles white. "My father told you I was married. He seemed almost pleased to tell me." Xavier's voice held old bitterness. "Said you had found a good man, someone reliable who had not run off and abandoned you. I left that same day. Went to California, worked on cattle drives, tried to forget you." Katherine closed her eyes. Her father had been furious when Xavier disappeared, not because he cared about her broken heart, but because he had already been planning their wedding, already counting the alliance with the Montgomery family as a business advantage. When Xavier left, her father had been humiliated, and Nathan Pierce was not a man who forgave humiliation. "My father died 3 years ago," she said quietly. "He never told me you came back. He never gave me any letters. I am sorry." Xavier's voice was thick with emotion. "Katie, I am so sorry. For all of it. For believing him when he said I had to leave that night without saying goodbye. For not trying harder to reach you. For not coming back sooner. For every single day you thought I had simply stopped caring about you." She opened her eyes and looked at him, really looked at him. She could see the truth in his face, the years of regret carved into every line. He had suffered too, she realized. Perhaps not in the same way, but he had carried his own burden of loss and grief. "Why did you come back now?" she asked. "Because my uncle died and left me his ranch in Colorado. Because I finally have something to offer besides empty hands and broken promises. Because I could not spend one more day not knowing if you were truly happy, if you had really found someone else, or if there was any chance you might." He trailed off, unable to finish. "Might what?" She heard the hardness in her own voice. "Might have waited for you. Might still love you after 12 years of silence. Might be willing to let me prove that leaving you was the worst thing I have ever done, and that I have never stopped loving you, not for a single moment of any single day." His hand moved as though to reach for hers, then fell back. "I am not asking you to forgive me, Katie. I am not asking you to forget. I am only asking for a chance to show you that the boy who left is not the same as the man who came back." Katherine stood abruptly, needing distance, needing air. She walked to the edge of the river where the water ran brown and sluggish in the late spring heat. Behind her, she heard Xavier rise, but he did not follow, giving her space to think. Everything she had believed for 12 years was wrong. He had not abandoned her callously. He had not simply decided she was not important enough to say goodbye to. He had been manipulated by his father, just as she had been manipulated by hers. They had both been young and trusting, and the people who should have protected them had instead destroyed what they had together. But knowing the truth did not erase the pain. It did not give her back those years of wondering what she had done wrong, of questioning her own worth, of learning to live with a heart that felt permanently damaged. The truth changed the story, but it did not undo the consequences. "I need time," she said finally, still facing the river. "This is too much to process in 5 minutes on a park bench. I understand." His voice came from where she had left him, respecting her need for distance. "I am staying at the Grand Hotel. I will be in Great Bend for as long as it takes, Katie. Whether that is another week or another year, I am not leaving until you tell me to." She heard his footsteps in the grass, moving away, giving her the solitude she needed. Only when she was certain he was gone did she let herself sink down onto the riverbank, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. She did not cry. She had used up all her tears for Xavier Montgomery years ago, but she sat there until the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the Kansas sky in shades of gold and crimson. When she finally returned to her boarding house, her longtime boarder Mrs. Sarah Hoffman was waiting on the front porch, a knowing look on her weathered face. Sarah had lived in Great Bend for 40 years and had been a friend of Katherine's late aunt. She saw everything and missed nothing. "I heard Xavier Montgomery is back in town," Sarah said without preamble as Katherine climbed the porch steps. "News travels fast." Katherine tried to move past her to the front door, but Sarah caught her arm gently. "Your aunt would have told you to listen to your heart, child." But your aunt was a romantic who never had her heart broken by a man who left her standing at the altar, metaphorically speaking. Sarah's blue eyes were sharp with concern. "I am going to tell you something more practical. That boy loved you with everything he had when he was here. Everyone in town could see it. Whatever happened, whatever reason he left, it hurt him to go. I saw him the day before he disappeared, and he looked like a man facing execution." "Why did you never tell me that before?" Katherine's throat felt tight. "Because you were healing, and sometimes healing means letting go. But now he is back, and you are a grown woman who can make her own choices. Just make sure whatever you decide is what you truly want, not what your anger or your pride or your fear tells you to want." Sarah patted her arm and headed inside, leaving Katherine alone with the gathering darkness and her tangled thoughts. Over the next week, Katherine saw Xavier in town several times. He did not approach her again, did not push or demand or even try to speak to her. He simply tipped his hat politely when their paths crossed and continued on his way, giving her the space she had requested. But she found herself watching him, noticing things. He helped old Mr. Carson carry supplies to his wagon without being asked. He stopped to assist a young mother whose child had fallen and scraped his knee, producing a clean handkerchief and kind words that stopped the boy's tears. He worked 3 days on a volunteer crew repairing the church roof damaged by a recent storm, his shirt soaked with sweat under the brutal Kansas sun. This was not the boy she had known, the rancher's son with grand dreams and easy charm. This was a man who had worked hard for everything he had, who knew the value of labor and community. She found herself grudgingly impressed, despite her determination to remain unmoved. On Sunday after church services, Xavier approached her again, this time in the company of others so it did not seem improper. "Miss Pierce," he said formally, as though they were mere acquaintances, "I wanted to return this to you." He held out a small wooden box, worn smooth with age and handling. Katherine recognized it immediately. It was the box he had carved for her 17th birthday, inlaid with her initials in mother of pearl he had traded for in Wichita. She had thought it lost when he disappeared, another casualty of that terrible time. "Where did you get this?" Her voice came out more sharply than she intended. "Your father gave it to me the day I came back, the day he told me you were married. He said you had left it behind because you wanted no reminders of me." Xavier's expression was neutral, but she heard the old hurt beneath his words. "I have carried it with me ever since. It seemed wrong to throw away something I made with my own hands, even if you no longer wanted it." Katherine took the box with trembling fingers. Inside, she knew, would be the small treasures of their courtship. A pressed flower from their first walk together, a ribbon from the harvest dance, a badly drawn sketch he had made of her laughing. She had mourned the loss of this box, had believed her father threw it away in his anger at being humiliated by Xavier's departure. "Thank you," she managed, "for keeping it safe." "There is something else inside," Xavier said quietly. "Something I put there before I left that night. I had planned to give you the box the next day to ask you something important. But then my father came to me with his ultimatum, and I never got the chance." Before she could respond, he tipped his hat and walked away, leaving her holding the box and a crowd of curious churchgoers pretending not to watch. Katherine hurried home, ignoring Sarah's raised eyebrows, and went straight to her private room on the second floor. With shaking hands, she opened the box. Everything was there as she remembered, but nestled among the keepsakes was something new. A ring. Simple gold with a small diamond that must have cost Xavier everything he could save from his ranch work. And beneath it, a letter, the paper yellowed with age but the ink still clear. "My dearest Katie," it began. "Tomorrow I am going to ask you to marry me. I am terrified you will say no, but I am more terrified of spending my life without you. You are the best part of every day, the reason I wake up smiling, the future I see when I close my eyes at night. I love you more than words can hold. Please say yes. Yours forever, Xavier." Katherine read the letter 3 times, her vision blurring with tears she had thought herself incapable of any more. He had been planning to propose. That was what he had lost when his father forced him to leave that night. Not just a sweetheart, but a future, a life they had both wanted. She carefully removed the ring from the box and slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, of course. Xavier had borrowed one of her other rings months before, claiming he wanted to have something made for his mother's birthday. She had believed the lie because she had been young and trusting and in love. The ring caught the afternoon light streaming through her window, sending small rainbows dancing across the walls. Katherine sat on her bed, staring at it, feeling the weight of years and loss and might have beens pressing down on her shoulders. There was a soft knock on her door. "Katherine," Sarah's voice gentle with concern. "Are you all right, dear?" "I do not know," Katherine answered honestly. She stood and opened the door, showing Sarah the ring on her finger, the letter in her hand. Sarah read the letter, her expression softening. "Oh, child, what are you going to do?" "I do not know that either." Katherine sank into the chair by her window. "Part of me wants to run to him right now and tell him yes, that I forgive everything, that we can start over. But Sarah, I am not that girl anymore. I am 31 years old. I own a business. I have built a life without him. How do I just set that aside? Who says you have to set it aside?" Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her arthritic hands folded in her lap. "Katherine, you have spent 12 years proving you do not need anyone. Maybe now is the time to ask yourself if there is anyone you want, regardless of need. I am afraid, Katherine admitted in a whisper. What if he leaves again? What if something else happens and I lose him? I barely survived it the first time. That is the risk of loving anyone, dear. We could all be gone tomorrow by illness or accident or any of the 1,000 dangers of living. You could turn Xavier away and spend the rest of your life safe and alone, or you could take a chance on happiness and see where it leads. Sarah stood creakily, her knees protesting. But whatever you decide, make sure it is your choice, not your fear's choice. After Sarah left, Katherine sat for a long time watching the sun set over Great Bend. The town was settling into its evening rhythms, smoke rising from cook stoves, children being called in from play, the saloon on the far end of town beginning to brighten with lamplight. This was her town, her home, her life. But was it enough? She thought about Xavier helping Mr. Carson, comforting that crying child, working in the hot sun to repair the church. She thought about the expression on his face when he looked at her. Like a man who had found something precious he thought lost forever. She thought about the boy who had carved a box with her initials, who had saved his pennies for a ring, who had written a letter full of hope and love and a future that never happened. And she thought about herself, about the woman she had become. Strong, yes. Independent, certainly. But also lonely in ways she had learned not to examine too closely. She had friends and boarders and a business, but she had no one to share her joys with, no one to hold her when the nightmares came, no one to dream with about tomorrow. The next morning, Katherine dressed with care in her best blue dress, the one that brought out the color of her eyes. She pinned her dark hair up carefully, leaving a few soft curls around her face. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back, nervous and hopeful and terrified all at once. She walked to the Grand Hotel with her spine straight and her head high, the ring still on her finger though now hidden beneath her gloves. The desk clerk directed her to Xavier's room on the second floor, giving her a knowing smile that made her cheeks warm. She knocked on his door before she could lose her courage. There was a long pause, then the sound of movement, and then Xavier was there, his shirt half unbuttoned, his hair disheveled as though he had just woken despite it being nearly 9 in the morning. Katie. He said her name like a prayer. Is everything all right? May I come in? She was acutely aware of the impropriety, but she was 31 years old and past caring what people thought. We need to talk. He stepped back immediately, ushering her into his simple room. It held little, a bed, a chair, a small table with a basin and pitcher. His saddlebags were in the corner, his coat hanging on a hook by the door. It was the room of a man who had not yet decided if he was staying. Katherine stood in the middle of the room, gathering her thoughts, her courage. Xavier waited, his dark eyes patient and wary at once. I read your letter, she said finally. The one you put in the box. His throat worked as he swallowed hard. Katie, that was written by a boy who thought he had forever to make things right. I do not expect you to honor anything it said. What if I want to? The words came out in a rush. What if I have spent the last week trying to convince myself I am perfectly fine alone, only to realize that fine is not the same as happy? What if I am tired of being strong and independent and safe, and I just want to take a chance on being foolishly, terrifyingly in love again? Xavier stared at her as though he could not quite believe what he was hearing. Katie, are you saying what I think you are saying? I am saying that I spent 12 years angry at you for something that was not entirely your fault. I am saying that my father and your father both manipulated us because they cared more about money and pride than about our happiness. I am saying that we were both victims, and neither of us deserves to spend the rest of our lives paying for their sins. She took a step closer to him. I am saying that you hurt me, Xavier, but you did not betray me, and maybe that difference matters." He reached for her then, his hands cupping her face with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "I loved you when we were young and stupid," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But Katie, I love you more now. I love the woman you became despite everything. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you have built a life on your own terms. I love that you made me wait, made me prove myself, did not just fall back into my arms the moment I showed up with an explanation and an apology." "I love you too," Katherine whispered, and saying the words aloud felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating at once. "I never stopped, even when I hated you. Even when I wanted to forget you existed, I loved you through all of it." He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the tentative kisses of their youth. This was a kiss of homecoming and promise, of years lost and futures reclaimed. Katherine melted into him, her hands gripping his shoulders, and for the first time in 12 years she felt whole. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know I have no right to ask. I know you have a business here and a life and every reason to tell me to go to hell. But marry me anyway, Katie. Let me spend the rest of my life making up for the years we lost." Katherine removed her glove, showing him the ring already on her finger. "I put it on yesterday," she admitted. "I tried to take it off a dozen times, but it felt wrong. It felt like it belonged there." Xavier's face transformed, joy breaking through like sunrise after a long dark night. He laughed, the sound rusty as though he had not had much practice lately, and pulled her close again. "Is that a yes?" "That is a yes," Katherine said, and then she was laughing too, giddy with relief and happiness and the sheer impossibility of it all. "But Xavier, we need to talk about practical things. My boarding house, your ranch in Colorado, how we make this work. We will figure it out," he promised. "I do not care if we live here or Colorado or the moon as long as we are together. Your business is important, Katie. I would never ask you to give up something you built with your own hands. We will find a way to make both work." They spent the rest of the morning talking, really talking about everything. Xavier told her about the years in Colorado, working for his uncle on a cattle ranch, learning the business from the ground up. He told her about the loneliness that had eaten at him, the way he had thrown himself into work to try to forget her. He told her about finally learning the truth about his father's manipulation, about the bitter confrontation that had ended with Xavier leaving his family's ranch forever. Katherine told him about inheriting the boarding house, about the hard work of making it profitable, about the satisfaction of building something of her own. She told him about her father's death, about discovering the letters Xavier had sent hidden in a locked drawer in Nathan Pierce's desk, about the rage and grief that had nearly consumed her. She told him about the long process of healing, of learning to live with loneliness, of occasionally considering other suitors but never being able to imagine a future with any of them. "I compared everyone to you," she admitted. "It was not fair to them, but I could not help it. No one else ever made me feel the way you did." "I never even tried with anyone else," Xavier said. "It would have been a lie to pretend I could love someone when my heart was already taken." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church, where they had once attended Sunday services together as starry-eyed youngsters. The whole town turned out, as much out of curiosity as genuine well-wishing. Sarah stood up with Katherine, beaming with satisfaction at having been proven right. Xavier's best man was his old friend Thomas Garrett, who had traveled from Colorado for the occasion, and who spent the entire ceremony grinning like a fool. Katherine wore a simple cream-colored dress that Sarah had helped her sew, with lace at the collar and cuffs. She carried wildflowers picked that morning from the prairie outside of town. Xavier wore his best suit, brushed clean of trail dust, and looked at her like she was the answer to every prayer he had ever whispered. When Reverend Mitchell pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier kissed her with enough enthusiasm to make the older ladies in the front pews titter behind their hands. Katherine did not care. She was married to Xavier Montgomery, and it felt like the writing of something that had been knocked askew for far too long. The reception was held in the church social hall, with food provided by seemingly every woman in Great Bend who could cook. There was music and dancing and enough good wishes to sustain them through a lifetime. Katherine danced with Xavier until her feet ached, laughing more than she had in years. "I cannot believe this is real," she confessed as they swayed together to a slow waltz. "I keep expecting to wake up and find out I dreamed it all." "If you are dreaming, then so am I," Xavier replied, pulling her closer in a way that was probably scandalous, but neither of them cared. "And I never want to wake up." They had agreed to live in Great Bend, at least for the immediate future. Xavier's uncle had left him the Colorado ranch in his will, but there was a capable foreman running it who could continue to do so, while Xavier and Katherine figured out their new life together. Xavier had some savings, enough to help Katherine expand the boarding house if she wanted, or to invest in some other venture that interested her. They had options, possibilities, a future that stretched out before them full of promise. Their wedding night was spent in Katherine's room at the boarding house, which Sarah had decorated with ribbons and flowers, and then made herself scarce along with the other boarders, who had all conveniently decided to visit friends that evening. Katherine was nervous in a way she had not expected, suddenly shy with this man she had known since childhood. Xavier seemed to sense her nerves. He took her hands in his and kissed them gently. "We do not have to rush anything," he said softly. "We have the rest of our lives, Katie." "There is no hurry," but Katherine shook her head, stepping closer to him. "I have waited 12 years to be with you again. I do not want to wait any more." They came together with a tenderness that gradually built into passion, relearning each other's bodies, discovering the ways they had changed and the ways they had stayed the same. Xavier whispered her name like a benediction, and Katherine felt tears slip down her cheeks, not from sadness but from the overwhelming relief of finally being whole again. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, the summer night warm around them. Xavier traced lazy patterns on Katherine's shoulder, his other arm pillowed beneath her head. "I am going to spend every day making sure you know you are loved," he murmured. "I promise you that, Katie. Whatever happens, however long we have, I will love you with everything I am." "I know," Katherine said, and she did. She could feel it in the way he held her, in the way he had waited patiently for her to come to him, in the way he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. "I love you too. So much it scares me sometimes." "Being scared is okay," Xavier said. "Being scared means it matters, and this matters more than anything." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and Katherine slept more peacefully than she had in 12 years. The next months passed in a blur of happiness. Xavier helped Katherine with the boarding house, proving surprisingly adept at repairs and maintenance. He charmed her boarders with his quiet competence and easy kindness. Mrs. Hoffman declared him a treasure and told Katherine she had made the right choice. Old Mr. Carson, who had been one of Katherine's first boarders and had a tendency to complain about everything, admitted grudgingly that Xavier seemed like a decent sort. They settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. There were adjustments, of course. Xavier was used to living rough, to the solitary life of ranch work, and sometimes he needed space to be alone with his thoughts. Katherine was used to running everything herself, making all decisions without consultation, and sometimes she forgot to include him in plans that affected them both. But they learned to communicate, to compromise, to work as partners rather than individuals. In August, a letter arrived from Colorado. The foreman at Xavier's ranch wrote that there had been trouble with rustlers, that some of the best breeding stock had been stolen, that he could use Xavier's help securing the property and dealing with the local law. Xavier read the letter with a frown deepening on his face. "I need to go to Colorado," he said heavily. "Just for a few weeks to get things sorted out. I am sorry, Katie. I know the timing is terrible." Katherine felt a spike of fear, a terrible echo of the night he had left before, but she pushed it down, reminding herself that this was different. He was not leaving her. He was going to deal with a business crisis and then coming back. They were married now. They had built something real and permanent. "I am coming with you," she said firmly. Xavier started to shake his head. It could be dangerous. "Rustlers are not known for their gentle manners. I would rather you stay here where you are safe." "We are married, Xavier. Where you go, I go. Besides, I am perfectly capable of handling danger. I survived 12 years of heartbreak. I think I can manage some cattle thieves." She crossed her arms, her expression brooking no argument. "I am coming." He looked at her for a long moment, then smiled, that wonderful warm smile that still made her heart skip. "All right, we go together." They left Great Bend a week later after making arrangements for Sarah to oversee the boarding house in their absence. The journey to Colorado took 5 days by train, and then another 2 by wagon from the nearest station to the ranch. Katherine had never been so far from Kansas, and she found herself both nervous and excited to see this part of Xavier's life. The ranch sprawled across a valley in the foothills of the Rockies, with mountain peaks visible in the distance, and the sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. The house was larger than Katherine expected, a solid 2-story structure built of logs and stone. There were several outbuildings, corrals, and in the distance she could see cattle grazing peacefully. The foreman, a weathered man named John Briggs, greeted them with obvious relief. "Mr. Montgomery, thank God. Things have been getting worse. We lost another dozen head 2 nights ago, and I am afraid some of the men are talking about taking matters into their own hands." Xavier's jaw tightened. Taking matters into their own hands is how people get killed. "I will talk to them. In the meantime, has the sheriff been any help?" "Sheriff Carson is doing what he can, but his jurisdiction is spread thin, and he is one man with no deputies to spare." John glanced at Katherine, then back at Xavier. "Begging your pardon, madam, but is it wise to have your wife here with all this trouble?" "My wife goes where she pleases," Xavier said mildly. "And she is tougher than she looks. Katie, this is John Briggs. John, my wife Katherine." Katherine shook John's hand firmly, ignoring his obvious surprise at her presence. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Briggs. Now, shall we discuss how to catch these rustlers?" Over the next week, Katherine proved herself more capable than anyone expected. She organized the ranch house, cooked for the men, and listened carefully to all the reports and theories about the rustling. She noticed patterns that the men had missed, small details about timing and locations that began to paint a picture. "They are hitting the eastern pastures most often," she pointed out one evening as they all sat around the dining table reviewing maps. "And always on nights with no moon. That suggests they know the land well enough to navigate in darkness." Xavier looked at her with impressed admiration. "That is a good observation, which means they are probably local or at least familiar with the area." "There is a box canyon about 5 miles east," John said slowly. "Good place to hide stolen cattle temporarily before moving them. But it is on the Barker spread, and old man Barker has never been friendly to anyone." "Maybe we should pay Mr. Barker a visit," Katherine suggested. Just a friendly, neighborly call, nothing accusatory. See what we can learn. They rode out the next day, Xavier and Katherine and John, leaving the ranch in the care of the other hands. The Barker Ranch was smaller and more run-down than Xavier's, with fences in need of repair and an air of general neglect. Silas Barker himself was a hard-faced man in his 50s who greeted them with suspicion. "Montgomery, heard you were back. What do you want?" No offer of hospitality, no invitation to light down from their horses. "Just wanted to introduce you to my wife," Xavier said pleasantly, as though Barker's rudeness was nothing unusual. "We are trying to meet all the neighbors." Barker's eyes flicked to Katherine, cold and assessing. "Heard you got married. Congratulations. That all you came for?" "We have been having some trouble with rustlers," Xavier continued, his tone still friendly but with an edge beneath it. "Wondered if you had seen or heard anything unusual." "Nope. My land, my business. I suggest you do the same." Barker crossed his arms. "Now if that is all, I got work to do." As they rode away, Katherine said quietly, "He is hiding something." "Agreed," Xavier replied. "The question is whether he is the rustler or just knows who is and does not want to get involved." That night Katherine could not sleep. She stood at the window of their bedroom, looking out over the moonlit valley, thinking about Barker's cold eyes and hostile manner. Something nagged at her, some detail she was missing. Xavier came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What is wrong?" "When we were at Barker's ranch, did you notice the corrals?" Katherine asked slowly, thinking it through. "They were empty, completely empty. No horses, no cattle, nothing. For a working ranch, that is strange." Xavier was quiet for a moment, then swore softly. "You are right. Even if he sold off his stock, he would have working horses at minimum, unless he is keeping his animals somewhere else. Like a box canyon where he is hiding stolen cattle," Katherine finished. The next day, Xavier rode to town and returned with Sheriff Carson, a tired-looking man who seemed grateful for any solid lead. With the sheriff's authority, they approached the Barker Ranch again, this time with several of Xavier's ranch hands as backup. What they found in the box canyon behind Barker's property confirmed Katherine's suspicions. Dozens of cattle with various brands, clearly gathered from multiple ranches over months of rustling. Barker was arrested, blustering and threatening, but the evidence was overwhelming. It turned out Barker had been hit hard by drought and falling cattle prices. Rather than ask for help or sell his land, he had turned to theft, justifying it to himself as taking from those who had more than they needed. His bitterness had eaten away at his judgment until crime seemed like a reasonable solution to his problems. With Barker in custody and the stolen cattle returned to their rightful owners, peace returned to the valley. Xavier was thanked by multiple ranchers, his reputation solidified as a man of honor and action, but he was quick to credit Katherine for solving the mystery. "My wife figured out what was happening," he told everyone who would listen. "I just followed her lead." Katherine found herself welcomed by the other ranch wives, invited to quilting bees and social gatherings. She liked Colorado, liked the mountains and the clear air and the sense of space. But she also missed Great Bend, missed Sarah and her familiar routines and the boarding house she had built. One night as they lay in bed in the ranch house, she broached the subject that had been bothering her. "Xavier, do you want to stay here? Make this our permanent home?" He was quiet for a long moment. "This ranch is successful and profitable. We could have a good life here. But I know you have ties in Kansas, your business and your friends. I told you I would not ask you to give that up." "What if we split our time?" Katherine suggested. "Spend summers here when the ranch needs the most attention, winters in Kansas running the boarding house. We could hire good people to manage both places when we are not there." Xavier rolled to face her, his eyes hopeful in the darkness. "You would be willing to do that, go back and forth." "I am willing to build a life with you," Katherine said simply. "Whether that life is in one place or two. I do not want to make you choose between your ranch and me any more than I want to choose between my business and you. So we find a way to have both." He kissed her then, slow and sweet. "Have I mentioned lately that you are the smartest person I know?" "You may have mentioned it once or twice," Katherine said, smiling against his lips. They spent another month in Colorado, getting the ranch fully secured and hiring additional hands to help John Briggs manage things in Xavier's absence. Katherine threw herself into organizing the ranch house, mending and cleaning and making it truly livable. She found she enjoyed the work, enjoyed being useful in a different way than she was at the boarding house. As September turned cool and golden, they prepared to return to Kansas. On their last night at the ranch, Xavier took Katherine out to the porch where they could see the stars scattered across the enormous Colorado sky. "I want to tell you something," he said, taking her hands in his. "These last few months with you, building this life together, figuring out how to compromise and work as partners, it has been the happiest time of my entire life. Better than I dreamed when I was a stupid boy who thought love was enough. Now I know love is just the beginning. Everything else, the work and the trust and the choosing each other every single day, that is what makes it last." Katherine felt tears prick her eyes. "You have become very wise in your old age, Xavier Montgomery." "I have had a good teacher," he replied, pulling her close. "You gave me grace when I did not deserve it, Katie. You could have sent me away with my apologies and my regrets, and no one would have blamed you. But you took a chance on us, and I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for that." "I did not do it for your gratitude," Katherine said. "I did it because somewhere under all the hurt and anger I still loved you. I think I always would have, even if I had never seen you again. But I am glad I did see you again. I am glad we got this second chance." They stood together in the mountain darkness, wrapped in each other's arms, and Katherine felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. Life would not be perfect. There would be challenges and setbacks, and the million small difficulties of building a life together. But they would face it all side by side, and that made all the difference. When they returned to Great Bend in October, Sarah greeted them with tears and tight hugs and 1,000 questions about Colorado. The boarding house had run smoothly in their absence, though Sarah made it clear she was glad to hand the responsibility back. "I am too old to be chasing after lodgers and fixing leaking pipes," she declared. "You two are back where you belong." Katherine settled back into her Kansas routine with relief and satisfaction. Xavier found work helping various ranchers around Great Bend, using the skills he had learned in Colorado, and quickly became known as someone reliable and knowledgeable. They attended church socials and community gatherings, slowly being accepted as simply Xavier and Katherine Montgomery, rather than the tragic young lovers who had been torn apart and miraculously reunited. Winter came early that year, with snow blanketing the prairie by mid-November. Katherine loved the way the boarding house felt during the cold months, warm and cozy with the stove burning and the smell of baking bread filling the rooms. She loved even more having Xavier there to share it with, to sit with by the fire in the evenings, to wake up beside on cold mornings. In January, Katherine missed her monthly courses. She waited another month to be certain before saying anything to Xavier, afraid to hope, afraid of disappointment. But when February came and went with no sign, she finally allowed herself to believe. She told him on a Sunday afternoon when the boarding house was quiet and they had the parlor to themselves. Xavier was reading the newspaper, his feet propped on the ottoman, looking comfortable and domestic in a way that made her heart swell. "Xavier, I have something to tell you." He looked up, immediately alert to the serious note in her voice. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong." Katherine sat beside him, taking his hand. "Everything is very, very right. Xavier, I am going to have a baby." For a moment he just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then his face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen. "A baby? Katie, are you certain?" "As certain as I can be. It should be born in late summer, around August if my calculations are correct." She found herself smiling too, caught up in his joy. Xavier pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she might break. "A baby," he repeated, wonder in his voice. "Our baby. Katie, I cannot believe it. This is the best news, the absolute best news." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Katherine found herself tired in a way she had never experienced before. Xavier was attentive to the point of being overprotective, insisting she rest more and work less. Sarah and the other women in town rallied around her, offering advice and hand-me-down baby clothes and a cradle that had served 3 generations. They decided to stay in Kansas that summer rather than going to Colorado, wanting Katherine to be near the doctor and the midwife when her time came. Xavier wrote to John Briggs explaining the situation, and John wrote back assuring him the ranch was doing fine and congratulating him on the coming addition to the family. In late July, Katherine was sitting in the parlor mending a sheet when she felt the first twinge of pain. She tried to ignore it, assuming it was just the usual discomforts of late pregnancy. But when the pains continued, growing stronger and more regular, she called for Xavier. He went pale at the sight of her face. "Is it time?" "I think so," Katherine said, trying to stay calm even as another contraction gripped her. "Could you fetch Mrs. Winters? And maybe you should get the doctor too." The next hours were a blur of pain and effort and fear. The midwife, Mrs. Winters, was calm and competent, talking Katherine through each contraction. The doctor came and declared everything was progressing normally, though Katherine wanted to scream at him that nothing about this felt normal. Xavier stayed by her side when Mrs. Winters allowed it, holding her hand and letting her grip his fingers hard enough to bruise. As afternoon faded to evening, Katherine thought she could not possibly continue. She was exhausted, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. But Mrs. Winters told her to push, and some instinct older than thought took over. Her son was born just as the sun set, coming into the world with a healthy wail that made Katherine laugh and cry at the same time. Xavier stared at the baby with an expression of absolute awe as Mrs. Winters cleaned him and wrapped him in a soft blanket. "You have a fine boy," Mrs. Winters said, placing the baby in Katherine's arms. "Strong lungs, good color. You did well, Katherine." Katherine looked down at her son's red, scrunched-up face and fell instantly, irrevocably in love. He had Xavier's dark hair and a surprisingly strong grip on her finger. He was perfect, absolutely perfect, and she could not imagine how she had ever thought her life was complete before this moment. Xavier leaned over them both, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "He is beautiful, Katie. He is perfect. Thank you. Thank you for giving me this." They named him Nathan Thomas Montgomery, Nathan for Katherine's father despite their complicated history, because Katherine believed in honoring family even when they were flawed. Thomas for Xavier's best friend who had stood up with them at their wedding. They called him Nate, and he quickly became the center of their world. Those first months were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Nate was a good baby, healthy and happy, but he still needed constant attention. Katherine found herself more tired than she had ever been, but also more fulfilled. Xavier was a devoted father, taking night feedings when he could, walking the floors with Nate when he was fussy, changing diapers without complaint. "I missed the first 12 years we should have had together," Xavier said one night as he rocked Nate to sleep. "I am not missing a single moment of his childhood." As Nate grew from infant to baby to toddler, Katherine and Xavier fell even more deeply in love. They had weathered storms and separation and heartbreak, and now they were building something beautiful from the ruins of what had been lost. They returned to Colorado for a month each summer, bringing Nate with them, introducing him to the ranch and the mountains and a different way of life. But Kansas was home. Great Bend was where they belonged. When Nate was 3, Katherine found herself pregnant again. This time she was less surprised and more prepared, though no less overjoyed. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1882, a tiny thing with Katherine's dark eyes and a surprising amount of reddish gold hair. They named her Grace Elizabeth Montgomery. Grace because that was what Katherine had given Xavier when he returned to Great Bend with nothing but regret and hope. Grace because that was what they had both received, a second chance neither of them deserved but both were grateful for. Elizabeth for Xavier's mother, who had passed away the previous year, but who had lived long enough to meet her grandson and rejoice in her son's happiness. With 2 children and the boarding house and the Colorado ranch, life became a beautiful chaos. Katherine learned to manage it all with efficiency born of practice, though she often fell into bed exhausted at the end of the day. Xavier supported her in every way he could, never complaining when dinner was late or the house was messy or the children were cranky. "This is everything I ever wanted," he told her on their 5th wedding anniversary. "You, our children, building this life together. I would not change a single thing." "Not even the 12 years we lost?" Katherine asked. Xavier was quiet for a moment, considering. "Not even that, because those years made us who we are now. You became strong enough to run your own business to give me grace when you had every reason not to. I learned what it means to lose something precious and how to never take it for granted. I am not glad we suffered, Katie, but I am grateful for what we learned from the suffering." Katherine understood what he meant. She had spent years angry about the time they had lost, the life they should have had. But somewhere along the way, she had realized that their story was not a tragedy. It was a story of redemption and forgiveness, and the stubborn persistence of love even through the darkest times. Nate grew into a bright, curious boy who loved the ranch and the wide, open spaces of Kansas with equal passion. Grace was more reserved, a thinker who could spend hours with a book or watching the clouds drift across the prairie sky. They were different but inseparable, the best of friends as well as siblings. As the children grew, Katherine and Xavier settled into middle age with grace and contentment. The boarding house continued to thrive, providing steady income and a sense of purpose. The Colorado ranch prospered under John Briggs' capable management and Xavier's periodic involvement. They had built something lasting, something good. On quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the boarding house was peaceful, Katherine and Xavier would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over Great Bend. Sometimes they talked about the past, remembering the young people they had been and marveling at all that had changed. More often they talked about the future, making plans and dreaming dreams. "You ever regret it?" Xavier asked one evening. "Giving me that second chance?" Katherine looked at him, at the lines around his eyes and the gray threading through his dark hair, at the hands that had held hers through joy and sorrow, at the man who had loved her for more than half her life, even when circumstances kept them apart. "Never," she said simply. Not for a single moment, because that was the truth. Xavier had returned after 12 years with nothing but regret, and she had given him grace. And from that grace, from that willingness to forgive and try again, they had built a love that would last the rest of their lives. Years passed in the way they do, measured in birthdays and anniversaries, in first days of school and skinned knees and childhood illnesses overcome. Nate grew tall and strong, passionate about ranching and talking about taking over the Colorado property someday. Grace discovered a love of teaching and spoke of opening a school in Great Bend when she was older. Katherine watched her children grow with pride and a bittersweet awareness of time's passage. Xavier was there for every milestone, every important moment, making up for the father he had not had in his own childhood. His father had passed away several years earlier, and though Xavier had attended the funeral, there had been no reconciliation, no last-minute healing of old wounds. Some things, Xavier said, were too broken to fix, but he was determined to be a different kind of father to his own children. In the summer of 1890, when Nate was 12 and Grace was 8, they made their annual trip to Colorado. The ranch had grown substantially over the years, and John Briggs, now in his 60s, had expressed interest in retiring soon. Xavier had been training a younger foreman to take over, but he also knew that Nate's passion for the ranch meant their son might eventually want to make it his life's work. They spent a month in the mountains that summer, and Katherine watched Nate blossom under the responsibility of real ranch work. He rode with the hands, helped with the cattle, learned to rope and brand. Xavier worked beside him, teaching and guiding, and Katherine saw in them an echo of what Xavier and his own father should have been, but never were. Grace preferred to stay closer to the ranch house, helping Katherine with cooking and chores, or reading in the shade of the big cottonwood tree in the yard. She was a thoughtful child, sensitive to others' feelings in a way that reminded Katherine of herself at that age. One evening, Grace asked Katherine, "Mama, is it true that Papa left you before you were married and then came back years later?" Katherine was surprised. They had never spoken to the children about those painful years, preferring to let them believe in a simpler love story. "Where did you hear that?" "I heard Mrs. Carson talking to Mrs. Hoffman when they thought I was not listening." Grace looked up at her mother with serious dark eyes. "She said Papa broke your heart and you were foolish to take him back." Katherine felt a flare of anger at the gossiping women, but she pushed it down. This was an opportunity to teach her daughter something important. "Your father did leave when we were young," she said carefully, "but it was not because he wanted to. His father forced him to go, and then my father kept us apart by lying to both of us. When your father finally came back and told me the truth, I had to make a choice. I could hold on to my anger and pride, or I could forgive him and see if we could build a life together." "And you chose to forgive him," Grace said. "I did, because I loved him, and because I realized that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is give someone a second chance." Katherine smoothed her daughter's hair back from her face. "People make mistakes, Grace. Sometimes terrible, hurtful mistakes. But if they are truly sorry and willing to do better, then showing them grace can lead to something beautiful. Like you and Papa," Grace said, smiling now. "Like your father and me," Katherine agreed. "We were given a second chance and we made the most of it. And that gave us you and your brother and this life we have together. So no, I was not foolish to take him back. I was brave, and it was the best decision I ever made." Grace hugged her tightly, and Katherine held her daughter close, grateful for this child and for the man who had given her this life. It had not been easy, and there had been years of pain, but everything had led to this moment, to this family, to this happiness. When they returned to Kansas in late August, there was a letter waiting from John Briggs. He wanted to retire that fall, and he recommended that Xavier either come to Colorado permanently or consider selling the ranch. It was too much responsibility to manage from a distance with an inexperienced foreman. Xavier and Katherine discussed it late into the night, weighing options and possibilities. Finally, they came to a decision. They would keep the ranch for now, with Xavier spending more time there each year. Nate would go with him during school breaks, learning the business in earnest. When Nate was 18 and ready to take on real responsibility, they would revisit the question of making Colorado their primary home. This meant more time apart than they liked, but it was a workable compromise. Katherine would stay in Great Bend with Grace, running the boarding house, while Xavier split his time between Kansas and Colorado. It was not perfect, but it honored both their commitments and gave Nate the opportunity to pursue his passion. The years of separation were hard but bearable because they had learned to communicate, to trust, to hold fast to their love even across distance. Xavier wrote to Katherine every week, long letters full of news from the ranch and expressions of love and longing. Katherine wrote back with stories of Grace's progress in school and the small dramas of boarding house life. When they were together, whether in Kansas or Colorado, they cherished every moment. They had learned not to take time for granted, to appreciate the gift of each day. Their love had been tested by separation once before, and they had survived it. This was different because it was their choice, their decision made together, and they both knew it was temporary. Nate thrived under his father's tutelage, growing into a capable young man who understood cattle and horses and the business of ranching. He was 17 when he told his parents he wanted to take over the Colorado ranch permanently after his 18th birthday. "I know it means I will be far from you and Mama and Grace," he said. "But this is what I want to do with my life. I love that ranch, Pa. I want to build it into something even bigger and better." Xavier looked at Katherine, and she saw pride and a little sadness in his eyes. Their son was grown, ready to make his own way. "If that is what you want, son, then you have our blessing," Xavier said. "But you need to understand the responsibility. Running a ranch is not just about riding horses and herding cattle. It is about business and management and dealing with people." "I know," Nate said. "You have taught me well, Pa. I am ready." On Nate's 18th birthday in 1896, they held a celebration in Great Bend and then traveled to Colorado for him to officially take over as owner and manager of the Montgomery Ranch. John Briggs came out of retirement for the occasion, shaking Nate's hand and telling him he had no doubt the boy would succeed. Watching her son step into manhood and his own future, Katherine felt the bittersweet ache of a mother's love. She was proud of him, proud of the man he had become, but she would miss him terribly. Colorado was a long way from Kansas, and she knew visits would be infrequent, but she also knew this was right. Nate had found his calling, just as she had found hers in the boarding house, and Xavier had found his in the ranch. Each of them was building something meaningful, and that was what mattered. With Nate settled in Colorado, Xavier and Katherine returned to Great Bend and to each other. Grace was 14 now, a bright, beautiful girl who had indeed decided she wanted to be a teacher. She was excelling in her studies and talking about going to the new teachers' college in Hayes after she finished her local schooling. "Both our children are going to leave us eventually," Katherine said one evening as she and Xavier sat on their porch. "The house is going to seem very empty." "We will fill it with other things," Xavier replied, taking her hand. "Grandchildren, perhaps, when Nate and Grace settle down. And we will still have each other, Katie. That has always been enough for me." Katherine squeezed his hand, marveling at how lucky she was. Not lucky, she corrected herself. Blessed. They had both worked hard for this happiness, had both chosen to forgive and trust, and build something beautiful from the ashes of what had been destroyed. In 1899, Grace graduated from her local school with honors, and prepared to attend teachers' college. Katherine helped her pack, trying not to cry at the thought of both her children grown and gone. But Grace hugged her tightly and promised to visit often, and Katherine knew she would. With both children launched into their own lives, Katherine and Xavier found themselves alone for the first time since the early days of their marriage. It was strange at first, the quiet house, the lack of youthful energy and noise, but it was also wonderful in its own way. They rediscovered each other, remembered what it was like to be just the two of them. They traveled more, visiting Nate in Colorado and Grace in Hayes, taking trips to see parts of the country they had never explored. Xavier was in his 50s now, his hair more gray than dark, but he was still strong and vital. Katherine had settled into middle age with Grace, her dark hair showing silver threads but her eyes still bright with life and intelligence. The boarding house continued to provide income and purpose, though Katherine hired more help now, preferring to spend time with Xavier rather than working from dawn to dusk. They had earned the right to slow down a bit, to enjoy the fruits of their labor. In the summer of 1901, Nate wrote to say he had met someone, a rancher's daughter named Mary Connell who lived on the neighboring property. They were courting seriously, and Nate hoped to bring her to Kansas to meet his parents soon. Katherine and Xavier welcomed Mary with open arms when Nate brought her to Great Bend that fall. She was a sensible young woman with a warm smile and a clear love for Nate. The wedding was held the following spring at the ranch in Colorado, a beautiful outdoor ceremony with the mountains as backdrop. Watching Nate marry, Katherine thought about her own wedding to Xavier, about the long road that had brought them to this moment. She caught Xavier's eye during the ceremony, and he smiled at her, that same smile that had made her heart skip when she was 17. Some things never changed. Grace graduated from teachers' college in 1902 and returned to Great Bend to open her own school. She had a gift for teaching, patience, and creativity that made her beloved by students and parents alike. She lived at the boarding house for a time, helping her mother run it, and Katherine treasured having her daughter close again. In 1904, Nate and Mary welcomed their first child, a son they named Xavier Nathan Montgomery. Katherine and Xavier traveled to Colorado to meet their grandson, and Katherine held the baby with tears streaming down her face. This was legacy, she thought. This was what they had built together, a family that would continue long after they were gone. Grace married in 1906, a quiet young banker named Robert Harrison who clearly adored her. They settled in Great Bend, and Katherine was grateful to have at least one of her children nearby. When Grace had her first child a year later, a daughter named Katherine Grace Harrison, Katherine felt the circle complete. She was a grandmother now, watching her children raise their own families, seeing her love for Xavier reflected in the next generation. It was a strange and wonderful feeling, this sense of continuity, of having built something that would outlast her own life. Xavier was in his late 50s, starting to slow down in ways he would not admit. His joints ached on cold mornings, and he tired more easily than he once had. But his eyes were still sharp, his mind still quick, and his love for Katherine had never wavered. One evening in 1908, 30 years after Xavier had returned to Great Bend with nothing but regret, Katherine and Xavier sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the Kansas sky in shades of gold and rose. They had been married for 3 decades, had built a life and a family and a legacy that neither of them could have imagined in those dark years of separation. "You remember the day I came back to town?" Xavier asked suddenly. "The look on your face when you saw me," Katherine smiled. "I wanted to die, or possibly kill you. I had not decided which." "I do not blame you." Xavier reached for her hand, their fingers interlacing with the ease of long practice. "I was terrified you would send me away, Katie. Terrified you had really moved on and built a life without me." "I had built a life," Katherine said. "Just not one I particularly enjoyed. I was surviving, not living. There is a difference." "And now," Xavier looked at her, his eyes still able to make her heart flutter. "Now I am living," Katherine said simply. "Now I have everything I ever wanted, even if it took a longer and harder road than I expected to get here." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the boarding house, a clock chimed the hour. Down the street, a dog barked. Life continued in its ordinary way, but nothing about this moment felt ordinary to Katherine. "Thank you," Xavier said quietly, "for giving me a second chance, for seeing past your hurt and anger to what we could be together, for having the courage to forgive me when I did not deserve it." "You did deserve it," Katherine corrected gently. "You made a mistake, but you owned it. You came back with regret and humility, willing to accept whatever I decided. That took courage too, Xavier, and it made all the difference." She thought about the younger version of herself, the woman who had stood in the street of Great Bend and watched Xavier with such carefully hidden pain. That woman had been broken but not destroyed, hurt but not hardened beyond repair. She had found within herself the capacity for grace, and from that grace had bloomed everything good in her life. "I would do it all again," Katherine said. "Every painful moment, every year of loneliness if it meant ending up here with you." Xavier raised her hand to his lips and kissed it tenderly. "As would I, my love. As would I." They remained on the porch until the night grew cool and the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns. Inside, the boarding house waited, warm and welcoming. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys, but tonight they simply sat together, two people who had loved and lost and found each other again, grateful beyond measure for the grace that had saved them both. Their story could have ended in tragedy, in permanent separation and lifetime regrets. But Katherine had chosen differently. She had chosen to see beyond the pain to the man who loved her, to give grace where others might have given condemnation, to believe in redemption and second chances. And from that choice had come everything beautiful in her life. As they finally rose and went inside, Xavier's arm around her shoulders and her head resting against his chest, Katherine felt the deep contentment of a life well lived. She had loved fiercely, forgiven completely, and built something lasting with the only man who had ever held her heart. That was enough. That was everything. Their remaining years together were gentle and sweet, marked by the small joys of grandchildren and quiet evenings, and the companionship of two people who knew each other completely. Xavier's health began to fail in his late 60s, his heart growing weaker despite his stubborn insistence that he was fine. Katherine nursed him tenderly, never leaving his side when he finally took to his bed in the winter of 1913. "I am sorry to leave you," he whispered one night when they both knew the end was near. "I wanted more time, Katie, so much more time." "We had 35 years," Katherine said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. 35 years of loving each other, of building a life together, of being happy. That is more than most people ever get, my love, and I will treasure every single moment until I see you again." Xavier died peacefully in his sleep 2 nights later, Katherine's hand clasped in his. She grieved deeply but without regret, because their love story had been complete. They had loved each other well, had forgiven and been forgiven, had built something beautiful that would outlast them both. Katherine lived another 12 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren, watching the world change in ways she never could have imagined when she was young. She kept the boarding house running until she was too old to manage it. then sold it to a young couple who promised to maintain it with the same care she had. She spent her final years with Grace and her family, content to be grandmother and great-grandmother, teller of stories about the old days. She spoke often of Xavier, of their love that had survived separation and pain, of the grace she had given him that had saved them both. When Katherine Pierce Montgomery died peacefully in her sleep in 1925 at the age of 78, her children found a letter she had written to be read after her death. In it, she reflected on her long life, on all the joys and sorrows she had experienced. But the heart of the letter was about Xavier, about the choice she had made that day in May of 1878 when he returned to Great Bend with nothing but regret. She wrote about grace and forgiveness, about the courage it takes to give someone a second chance, about how love can survive even the darkest times if both people are willing to fight for it. "He was my first love," she wrote in her careful, elderly hand, "and he was my last love. He was the greatest challenge and the greatest gift of my life. I gave him grace when he returned after 12 years, and that grace gave us everything beautiful that came after. If I could go back and change our story, remove the pain and the separation, I would not do it. Because that suffering taught us how to love each other properly, how to value what we had, how to never take a single day for granted. Our love story was not easy, but it was real and true and lasting, and I would not trade it for anything." Her children and grandchildren read the letter through tears, understanding at last the full depth of what Katherine and Xavier had shared. It was a love story for the ages, a testament to the power of forgiveness and the beauty of second chances. In the churchyard in Great Bend, Kansas, there are two headstones side by side. Xavier Montgomery, who died in 1913, and Katherine Pierce Montgomery, who joined him in 1925. On Katherine's stone, beneath her name and dates, is carved a simple epitaph chosen by her children. She alone gave him grace, and perhaps that was the truest summary of her life, the thing she would most want to be remembered for. Not her success as a businesswoman or her devotion as a mother, though those things mattered, but the grace she had shown to a man who hurt her, the forgiveness she had extended when she had every right to refuse it, the second chance she had given that had transformed both their lives. Their descendants still gather in Great Bend from time to time, coming from Colorado and other parts of the country to remember their heritage. They tell the story of Xavier and Katherine, of first love lost and then found again, of grace given and received, of a love that conquered time and pain and separation. And the story endures, passed down through generations, a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is forgive. Sometimes the strongest love is the one that survives being broken and then carefully, painfully mended. Sometimes grace is not weakness but the highest form of courage. That was Katherine's legacy, more lasting than any building or business. She had loved well, forgiven completely, and built something beautiful with the man who had held her heart from the time she was 17 until the day she died. And in the end, that was all that truly mattered.